Allora, vi do il benvenuto all'ultimo binomio d'eccezione Titubanti Testi 11, binomio di lettura. Ed è per un grandissimo piacere, dopo aver ascoltato la scorsa volta un binomio sull'Edipo Re di Sofocle, avere per la prima volta in 11 cicli l'Eneide di Virgilio, quindi stiamo andando alla grande e finiamo in bellezza con due testi ipercanonici non solo delle letterature antiche, ma delle letterature occidentali, direi. Anche il passo in questione è super canonico, super letto e riletto, quindi siamo particolarmente curiosi di ascoltare i nostri due speaker, anche loro di eccezione, virgilianisti molto molto noti, Sergio Casali da Roma che ha proposto il testo, Aaron Kachuck da Louvain-la-Neuve. We are going to switch in English, I believe, but please feel free to use, during the discussion, you can use all languages because I'm sure that everybody is able to understand. So, Aaron, yours is the floor. Thank you very much.
Ringrazio Marchio Formisano for this introduction and mi scuso profondamente di aver parlato in inglese oggi. Io ho promesso che la prossima volta io parlo italiano. I'll just share this screen here if I can. See if I can figure out how to do that. Give me 1 second. Back here, sorry. It's all just gone a bit mad just now. Okay, let's see. So I go back here and say share. And as I do so, I'll just can get ready. So I'll just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Aaron Kachuck. As Marco said, I'm professor of Latin authors and Latin literature at UC Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. I had my start as a comparatist in comparative literature, working in Semitic languages and then in Greek. And I just keep on moving my way forward in time, and so find myself now a nomad wandering for now in the Latin lands and in the lands of Romanitas. As I was when I was first thrown this passage from at the invitation of Sergio Casali of Juno's temple in the Aeneid, the first thing that came to my mind was a bit from Wallace Stevens' great poem on his notes towards a supreme fiction. Wallace Stevens, a great American poet of the 20th century, says, "From this the poem springs, that we live in a place that is not our own, and much more not ourselves, and hard it is in spite of blazoned days." Aeneas is thrown into this world, thrown into his poem, as are we here in Carthage. And we have to figure out what kind of rules we are going to play by in this new and strange world. And the difficulty is, of course, that it has so many similarities to worlds that we know, worlds that have been made by past poets, that the trick is trying to get in what is peculiar, what is strange about Virgil's own world making, how he creates his own cosmos as he goes. And one early lesson in how to do this comes here in Juno's temple. This is the title of my little intervention today, which will be no longer than 20 minutes, I promise. Juno's temple and the structure of Virgil's Aeneid, an essay in what I call intergesturality. We'll come to that. Lucus in urbe fuit media laetissimus umbrae. There was a grove at the city's center, most glad in its shade. This passage builds a world, and it puts Aeneas at its center, observing images on this temple in this grove. 3 centuries earlier, Herodas's fourth mime had painted a risible portrait of 2 poor women tastelessly admiring priceless artwork. A century earlier, Euripides' Ion had staged a chorus describing the murals in the Temple of Apollo in such a way as to prefigure the drama that would follow. Virgil's Temple of Juno transsumes his models. It is both miniature model of the Aeneid, a cosmic icon, and also an incarnation, felt and heard as much as seen and known, of the name and destiny of Aeneas, the man and his arms. In what follows, we too will seek not only to see, but also to hear and feel. In this sense, we will practice what I've recently called intergesturality, the study of gestures and their interactions within and between works and other cultural spheres. A gesture, we shall see, is an intertext like any other. We're at the city's center, in urbe media. In Rome, what would find here tokens of cosmic centering. The umbilicus urbis with its mundus and the miliarium aureum, the city's point zero. The verse designs the geography it describes. Media in the middle. What is at the city's center, by contrast, bounds the verse. Lucus laetissimus umbrae, a grove or clearing most happy in its shade. Here, Vergil takes sides on an ancient etymological puzzle. Is a lucus sunny, hence a glade, or shady, hence a grove? Lucus a non lucendo. It is a grove because it admits no light. In English, to catch the pun, one might call it a glade most glad in shade, or a shady glade most glad. As often, Vergil's etymologic gloss of the very word comes in close proximity here, umbrae, symmetrical at the line's end. Meanwhile, Lucus laetissimus offers in charming homoioteleuton an etymological definition. What is a lucus, Vergil Grammaticus asks us, but a place glad for shade. Hence, in this way, both luminous in the joy it gives and shady in the sun it keeps out. This is a happy shade, unlike the shade that had ended Vergil's eclogues, dangerous for sheep, shepherd, singer, plants, and us. This grove, Carthage's grove, and its shady delights are visited by Aeneas, et terris jactatus et alto, cast upon lands and sea, but they had been visited before this by other people, jactati undis et turbine, thrown upon waves and whirling deep. The Poini, moving horizontally from waves to glade, these people dug effodere down. Everything moves to this place, with the hyperbaton of quo and loco, you'll have to have your own text at hand, holding us in suspense and guiding Aeneas, guiding us, guiding the Poini here, where they find at journey's end, and we find at sentence's stop, a signum. It was Juno Regina who showed this to them, this head of a spirited horse, signam, so that thus, say our editions, the Punic race would prove forever as remarkable and robust. Here in this grove, the Carthaginians build a temple, and around that temple, they build a city. First, we must look. In the middle of a shady wood, in the middle of the city, Aeneas finds the giant temple of Juno, Templum Junoni Ingens, line 446. It is rich with gifts and with the spirit of the goddess, donis opulentum et numine divae, a daring zeugma, already combining the physical, donis, gifts, adornments, with the impalpable, numine, divine spirit. Now here I'd like to take in Kirk Freudenberg's invitation in his recent book on Vergil's Aeneid and the cinematic art to apply this kind of a reading method to a scene that he does not touch in this way here. Here, Vergil invites our eyes and our ears to follow Aeneas's eyes, Vergil's eyes, up the stairs of the temple where all is bronze. Aerea limina, aere trebis, foribus aenis, bronze frame, bronze joints, bronze doors. If Aeneas will soon see himself on this temple's walls, his hyper-identification is primed by this temple's bronze entry, by its materials, therefore made of himself, of Aenea. Vergil varies his adjectives here in order to culminate with the most Aeneas-like adjective, from aerea, nominative adjective, to aere, ablative noun, to finally aenis, different adjective in the dative. Aeneas thus enters this temple by way of the stuff of which his own future panoply will be made by Vulcan, thus prefiguring the poem's fulfillment of the opening words, fusing arms and man, already one. We have looked. Now we listen. The temple's doors, bronze doors, are fixed to a hinge. This hinge, says Vergil, stridebat, creaked or even screeched. On the one hand, this is variatio of description. Instead of simply saying that these doors have a bronze hinge, Vergil tells us how they would sound were they to be opened, except that when we follow the ascent up the stairs to the doorway and then hear how the door screeched, this also constitutes an invitation to enter this temple, sight, sound, body, and all. Does Aeneas enter this temple? Does he cause its doors to creak, to screech, to shriek? Any which way, what we hear as he enters the temple, as we perhaps hear the sounds of footsteps echoing in the temple's forecourt or cella. Remember, Aeneas and Anchises are enclosed in an invisible cloud. We cannot see them rising these steps or approaching this temple, but we could perhaps catch their footsteps and certainly the screech of a swinging, whining door. Now, there's something paradoxical, favoring schizophrenic even about what follows. Aeneas here puts away fear, begins to hope as he walks about Lustra, this temple, and looks at the scenes on its walls. Looking at the past makes him cheery about his future, but where exactly does he see these scenes? Most imagine him observing reliefs on the temple's exterior. We must wander around with him. In this way, the temple would remind readers of the Iliou-Persis reliefs on the northern metopes of the Parthenon, of the chorus of the Ion looking at the exterior reliefs of the Temple of Delphi, or Messala's appreciation of the gigantomic frieze on the Temple of Zeus and Acragos that we might see in Bellum Punicum, fragment 7, which might also have included a depiction of the fall of Troy. Now, this indeed is how most have read Vergil's scene here, and yet the whole scene takes place, says Vergil, sub ingenti templo. For Servius, this means Aeneas is in the temple, in templo. Later, Dido will approach the temple ad templo and seat herself in the doors of the goddess in the middle of the coffered roof, the turtle of her temple, the testudine, which Servius sees as meaning either that she sits under the roof that hangs over both the temple and the pronaos, or that she is simply within the temple's doors. Either way, the passage allows for Aeneas to walk as easily within as without the temple, thus making sense of putting those screeching doors. Any which way, what we next hear are Aeneas's tears, crying, lacrimans. He speaks to Achates, and groaning excessively, multa gemens, he wets his cheeks with rushing rivers of tears, largo quumectat flumine vultum, and lets forth an enormous groan from his chest, ingentem gemitum dat pector rabimo. Only now will he even recognize himself intermixed amidst the Greek princess, se quoque agnuit. We see Aeneas seeing himself, while we listen to him cry. Aeneas's tears at this succession of static images combines the Delphic relief of Euripides' Ion and Odysseus's tears at the unfolding song of Demodocus in Homer's court of the Phaeacians. This simply could have been an alternative site for Schelling's meditations upon the Laocoon. But here, Aeneas in tears becomes evermore himself, nomen evermore omen. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, the goddess explains that her son is called Aeneas because she felt awful grief, ainon achos, for sharing the bed of a mortal man. Anchises' mortality is what pains Aphrodite. Here Aeneas sees himself and feels both hope and sadness because mortality touches the mind. Mentem mortalia tangunt. In this light, Aeneas's recognition of himself permixtum, intermixed amidst the Greeks, might recall the leitmotif of the Homeric hymn of Aphrodite, Aphrodite's embarrassment over having mixed in love, philotete migenai, as the hymn puts it, more than once with the mortal Anchises. This temple, into which Aeneas, around which Aeneas wanders, within which we also wander, helps us see Aeneas as he has been, as he is, and as he will become, as he might become. It does the same for the Aeneid as a whole. Let us begin with the last thing that Aeneas sees on the walls before Dido's arrival, the great Bellatrix, warrior queen of Amazon's Penthesilea. The daring of this queen to vie with men balances to Aeneas's daring at passages beginning to first here find hope, audet and audet, perhaps through a prism of misreading. Aeneas doesn't realize that he's in a place of adverse semiotic signification. This is not a temple that should be favorable to him, but one day it shall be. With looks to future futures, his visions end just after wherein an Alexandrian Scholian concludes an alternative Iliad. Elthe Damazon, and the Amazon came. As Dido builds her city around Juno's signum of the horse, Vergil is building his poem around an Alexandrian Iliad, which ends with the death of horse-taming Hector and the arrival of the daring Amazon Penthesilea. Vergil's daring queen anticipates and prefigures Dido's arrival as it prepares Aeneas, primes him, our cognitive colleagues would say, to be impressed by, drawn to, obsessed with this remarkable woman. If Dido is a dark double of Aeneas as refugee founder, Penthesilea, too, in her speaking name is the same. She is Penthos, suffering for her Laos, her people. In this respect, of course, she is the female mirror of Achilleus, who is like Aeneas, an achos, a pain. In this, Penthesilea looks back to Homer, forward to Dido, but also mirrors Aeneas. She also prefigures the end of Vergil's poem. This Amazon queen has tied a golden cingula, a sword belt, around her uncovered breast. Cingulae are bad luck in this play. They reappear but twice, always with fateful issue. Thus, Euryalus, in his night raid of the Latin camp, will, following a vengeful massacre of sleeping enemies, despoil the dead Italian Ramnes of his aurea bullis cingula, his sword belt, golden in its studs. Its former owner had been equally unlucky. Wealthy Caedicus had once upon a time Olim given it upon his deathbed to his grandson Remulus of Tibur, a touching transmission from a generation to another. But its new owner now dead, the Rutulians, victorious in battle, took it for themselves. The cingula's latest owner thus dies, and a new one takes it up, and umeris nequicum fortibus aptat, which means here both that he fits them in vain to his strong soldiers, and also that he fits them to his vainly strong shoulders, for no amount of individual human strength could vie with the curse of the cingula. Ardent Euryalus wears this cingula now on his shoulders, and it is then, having donned an ornamented enemy helmet, that he finds himself tracked by Italian cavalry. Euryalus' gleaming helmet prodidit gives him away, betrays him, though he himself is unaware. He is wearing his helmet, so he can't see how it gleams outward with rays of light. The mounted Italian captain Vulcans makes chase, and Euryalus even still might have gotten away, had he not been slowed down, impediunt, by darkness, which could not be helped in a night raid, but also by the heavy lute, onerosaqua praeda. In Vergil's enchanted world, objects, like the cingula, can be cursed. The third and final cingula of the poem is equally dangerous, for it brings the life of Turnus, and of course our poem, to a furious end. Aeneas, enraged by the sight of Pallas's cingula upon Turnus's shoulders, will stab Turnus sub pectore. In this way, the previous cingulae with their studs are brought together, and in ways that we can recognize, as Aeneas recognized the studs he knew so well, the notis bullis. The cingula gleam like Euryalus' helmet, and sit insignis upon his shoulders, just like the cingula that weighed down Euryalus, hampering his escape. And if Penthesilea were her cingula under her exposed breast, she has only one, for she is a true Amazon, then Turnus will receive his death stroke in the male equivalent sub pectore, precisely where he had, in his dream, received Alecto's phantasmagoric, psychotropic firebrand. Further, Turnus's grudging death at the end of Book 12, vitaque cum gemitu fugit indignata sub umbras, precisely and word for word repeating the death of another Italian warrior toward the end of Book 11, the warrior princess Camilla, also described as an Amazon, who resembles no one so much, says the poet, as Penthesilea herself, exulting in the great ululating tumult of battle. In this way, upon Juno's temple, the Amazonian Penthesilea that concludes the series of murals Aeneas observes in his illustration precisely anticipates the conclusion of Aeneas's poem as a whole. It also initiates what we could call the tale of cingulae that point forward to the death of Euryalus and via the death throes of the Amazonian Camilla to Turnus's death. Exit then with a cingula, but also, as we have seen, as we have heard, with a groan. Camilla, or rather her vita, her life or life force, heads to the shadows, cum gemitu, with a groan, as of course does Turnus's vita, his life or life force. In a forthcoming article, Intergesturality in the Structure of Vergil's Aeneid, I've proposed a new model, intergesturality, that allows us to read not only words, but also gestures, postures, movements, and sounds that they present to us, gesturality, and to show how these interact with such corporal and sonic gestures in this and in other works, hence intergesturality. There, I show how ritual gestures structure the Aeneid, including, in one part of the article, rituals of lamentation, and I quote, with apologies for quoting myself, with groan begun and with groan ended. It is the first and last human sound we hear in this poem. In this, the poem as a whole reflects the life cycle as represented by an epigram by the late antique poet Palladas, crying I was born and crying I will die. All of life I have found to pass among many tears. Sunt lacrimae rerum. There is a tearfulness to life, said Aeneas when arrived in Carthage. To life and to Vergil's poem, from Aeneas's entrance to Turnus's exit and the poem's conclusion. In Juno's temple, we hear the same. We must not forget to be surprised by what we are reading in Vergil's poem, and what this reading allows us to hear, following the screeching of the bronze doors through all of Aeneas's temple tour. He is crying. His cries and groans grow louder. There is a crescendo as he continues, culminating in the giant groan he gives from the bottom of his chest, dat pectorent abimo. We are a world away from touristic temple tour of Euripides' Ion, or the parody of tourism in Herodotus' Mimes. Far we can imagine, too, from Naevius's Masala at Akragas, as we are from Propertius's admiration for the Temple of Apollo in the Palatine. Aeneas walks, looks, cries, and groans. If we do not hear these, if we do not see the motions that accompany them, then we understand little of this scene, and little, too, of his too famous dictum, sunt lacrimae rerum. With these words, Aeneas also explains himself, because his actions are strange, and are meant to be strange. Odysseus's tears and Demodocus's song transferred here to the urbane pleasure of art exhibits. In Vergil's Rome, one could stroll outside of temples to see reliefs, or within them to see paintings, such as these, as one could do too in Rome's newly public library. But what respectable Roman would wander round such museums in the way that Aeneas does, meandering, nomadic, groaning, in tears? It is precisely this strangeness, this shock of Vergil's poem that we can attempt to recover if we take up the invitation to follow its hero into strange new worlds, the worlds of the poets, sometimes the characters' own making. Strange, but with a strange coherence of their own, as we have seen. Juno's temple is a training ground, a paradoxical training ground for Aeneas, but also for us in this world of adverse signification as we enter this poem, and the adventure in building worlds that it asks us to join. Juno's temple and Aeneas's tears reflect as in a dark mirror the hopeful prophecies of Jupiter's speech to Venus in this same book. To that speech's confidence, to Jupiter's confidence, it counters with the bodies that strew the paths of victory. In this, the temple of Juno prepares for Vergil's greatest tale of woe, that of his Aeneas and his daring Queen Dido. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This was just amazing, and I'm sure it will open up a very rich discussion. Now we are eager to listen to Sergio also to complete this wonderful discussion. You have the micro off, Sergio? Yeah, now.
Okay, yes. Yeah. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Sergio Casali, and I teach Latin language and literature at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. For a number of years now, my main scholarly focus has been Vergil's Aeneid. I published an Italian language commentary on Book 2 and a short guide to the Aeneid in 2023. What particularly interests me about the poem is its self-reflexive character, its continuous engagement with and reflection on epic poetry, both of the Homeric kind and of the panegyric and propagandistic type. It is this interest in Vergil's meta-epic technique that led me to propose to my friend Marco Formisano the passage we are discussing today. Unfortunately, due to a series of setbacks, I was unable to prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I sincerely apologize for this, but I trust that having Vergil's text in front of you, and so I share at least no, well, I want to share the text.
No, Sergio, stai
Sto facendo pasticcio, vero?
Sì,
Okay,
allora devi aprire, no, è molto semplice. Devi aprire il testo prima, il testo che vuoi mostrare sul tuo schermo, e poi vai a condividere e a finestre, e lo trovi là. Non devi cliccare su web, ma su finestre. Non so come è scritto da te, immagino finestra.
Si vede il testo?
No.
No. Vuoi sentire? Consenti, condivisione finestra? No. Si vede il testo dell'edizione di Conte?
Sì, perfetto.
Okay, I'm sorry. We are dealing here with the first actresses that the reader of the Aeneid encounters. The description of a work on art, more precisely the paintings that adorn the Temple of Juno in Carthage. These paintings are famously described through Aeneas's gaze. It is through Aeneas's eyes that we learn not only what is depicted on the temple walls, but also, crucially, how these images are interpreted by him. From his viewing of the scenes portrayed in the Temple of Juno, Aeneas infers something about the intentions of the artists and even of the royal patron behind the commission. The images depict episodes from the Trojan War, some Homeric, others either pre or post-Homeric, and because these scenes include the sufferings of the Trojans, Aeneas takes them as signs of empathy and compassion on the part of the Carthaginians and their queen. From this he concludes that he and his companion Achates may at least hope to have found a people well disposed toward them and therefore a chance of salvation. Yet, as has been recognized, first, if only in embryonic form, in Brooks Otis's 1963 monograph, Vergil, A Study in Civilized Poetry, and then independently by Keith Stanley in a 1965 article in the American Journal of Philology, Aeneas's interpretation may well be entirely mistaken. While Aeneas sees in these images of the Trojan cycle a sign of Carthaginian sympathy for the Trojans, the context, namely the temple of Juno, the Trojans' arch enemy, strongly suggests that the intention of the Carthaginian artists was rather to celebrate the Greek victory at Troy. The Trojan defeat and suffering would have been depicted not with compassion, but with a kind of grim satisfaction. As Stanley memorably put it, the panel, quote, the panels do not mean what Aeneas thinks they do, end quote. This line of interpretation was later developed in Ralph Johnson's Darkness Visible, 1976, and has since become, to some extent, the dominant scholarly reading of the passage. So what we are faced with here as the poem's first text within the text, quite simply a spectacular misreading. Aeneas overwhelmed by emotion and interprets the images in a way that is superficial and entirely focused on content. His readings fails to take into account not only the likely intentions of the artists, but also the basic visual cues embedded in the paintings themselves, the very details through which the Carthaginians tells their version of the Trojan War. It is worth noting that Vergil never explicitly tells us that Aeneas is misinterpreting what he sees. The only hint in this direction is found in the narrator's words that immediately follow Aeneas' speech to Achates. A speech which ends with the line Solve metus feret haec aliquam tibi fama salutem. Set aside your fears, this fame will bring you some deliverance. the lines of the narrator I'm talking about are 464, 65. Sic ait atque animum pictura pascit inani. The phrase pictura inani has drawn much attention. It may be read, as has often been suggested, in contrast to the relative materiality of sculpture, as alluding to the lost reality of the war, of which only a representation now remains. Most of the characters named in the images are already dead. But inani may also signal something more. It could imply that the comfort Aeneas draws from the paintings is not only fragile because it comes from art, but also because it is based on a profound misreading of that art. The solace is vain because the interpretation on which it rests is fundamentally flawed. A powerful talk I recently heard by Matthew Gorey at the Symposium Cumanum adds further weight to this interpretation. Gorey showed convincingly that the phrase pictura inani carries philosophical resonance and can be situated within ancient debates between Epicurean and Stoic thinkers concerning the epistemological value of images seen in dreams or visions. Yet I believe that pictura inani is not the only clue that Aeneas is mistaken in his reading of the images. Several details within the ekphrasis itself, I would argue, suggest to the reader, though not to Aeneas, that the intentions of the artist were clearly pro-Greek and anti-Trojan. Let us consider a few of these details. Following two brief lines describing a general battle scene, in lines 466-8, Vergil focuses on a more specific episode. Aeneas, we are told, tearfully recognizes the tents of Rhesus, ravaged by Diomedes, who seizes the Trojan king's horses before they can graze in the field of Troy or drink from the waters of the Xanthus. 469-73. The killing of Rhesus and the theft of his horses form the subject of Iliad 10. It is surely no coincidence that the first detailed scene described in the ekphrasis, disrupting the chronological sequence of events, is a depiction of this episode from Iliad 10, a book that stands out in the Homeric corpus for its aggressively pro-Greek and anti-Trojan tone. This is hardly a surprising choice for artists working on behalf of Juno's temple. We do not know whether this scene is described first because it is the first one Aeneas notices, or because it is literally the first in the visual sequence depicted in the temple. But what is clear is that Aeneas, in recognizing with tears the destruction wrought by Diomedes upon the Thracian camp, pays no attention to the broader mythographic framing that the artist had incorporated. Here Vergil seems to allude to a version of the myth in which an oracle had foretold that Troy would never fall if Rhesus, or in some version his horses, were to drink from the Xanthus. This story is not found in Homer. A version in which the prophecy concerns Rhesus himself appears in the tragedy Rhesus attributed to Euripides, while other sources mention both variants. The version of the oracle, seemingly referenced by the Carthaginian artists, could well be seen as pro-Greek. It lends strategic meaning and purpose to the otherwise gratuitous violence of Iliad 10. In Homer, the episode appears as a night raid devoid of a broader consequence. In this alternative tradition, however, it acquires a critical function in securing the eventual fall of Troy. From this perspective, the emphasis placed on the story of Rhesus within the temple's decorative program would align with a Greek and hence anti-Trojan viewpoint. Let us now consider the next scene, the killing of Troilus by Achilles. Troilus is mentioned in Iliad 24 in the list recited by Priam of his sons killed the war. There he is given an epithet connected to his kill with horses. His death at the hands of Achilles was narrated in the Cypria, and the story was also the subject of a lost tragedy by Sophocles. There, the youth was ambushed by Achilles near the temple of Apollo Timbreus, where he had gone to exercise his horses. The scene represented in the temple, however, does not appear to presuppose this version, in which a defenseless Troilus is caught by surprise while tending his horses, but rather a later variant attested in post-classical sources where Troilus is killed in open battle. The phrase amissis armis suggests that Troilus has lost his defensive gear, his shield and helmet, as implied by Comae at line 477, while still in some way managing to hold on to his spear. Line 475 seems to make it clear that the boy has actively sought out this unequal fight with Achilles. This episode, too, was associated with one of the Fata Troiana. According to a well-known oracle, if Troilus had reached the age of 20, Troy would never have fallen. In this case, unlike the Rhesus episode, Vergil does not refer explicitly to the oracle tradition, but the juxtaposition of Rhesus and Troilus inevitably evokes the parallel. Here again, then, the interpretation embedded in the visual program can be seen pro-Greek. The unequal duel between the mighty Achilles and the adolescent Troilus is retrospectively justified by the prophecy that linked Troilus's death to the downfall of Troy. Moreover, the particular variant chosen by the Carthaginian artists, where Troilus actively seeks out combat with Achilles, is obviously more favorable to the Greek cause than the more sympathetic tradition in which the boy is caught off guard in an ambush. The fifth scene, Hector's corpse, line 483-7, is once again highly revealing. Achilles is shown accepting gold for Priam in exchange for the ransom of Hector's body, an episode from Iliad 24. The version of the story offered in the temple paintings is far more brutal than Homer. Aeneas, of course, responds to it as though it were a moving and pathetic image designed to inspire pity. Yet the tone of the artwork is more likely one of satisfaction of triumph. In Homer, Hector is first dragged from the battlefield to the Achaean camp in Iliad 22. Then, at the beginning of Iliad 24, Achilles drags his body 3 times around the tomb of Patroclus and leaves it face down in the dust. As the iterative verbal forms in the Greek make clear, this ritual is repeated every morning at dawn. In the scene depicted in the temple, however, Hector is dragged around the walls of Troy, a detail that seems to follow not Homer, but a tragic tradition. The divine reaction to this outrage is a crucial part of the Homeric context. All the gods pity Hector and urge that Hermes be sent to retrieve his body, all except Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, who still harbor their ancient hatred for sacred Ilion, for Priam and his people. Later, when Apollo criticizes Achilles for his cruelty, it is Hera who speaks in Achilles' defense. The scene of Hector's desecration, that is, entirely fitting as a decorative image for the temple of Juno, presented here in a pro-Achillean and anti-Trojan light. The next scene is the most enigmatic of all. Aeneas, recognizing himself, mingled among the Greek leaders. Sequoque principibus permixtum magnovit Achivis, 488. What is puzzling is that Vergil does not specify what action Aeneas is engaged in. Most of the other scenes feature a clearly defined event. But here, as also in the subsequent mention of Memnon, Aeneas simply notes his presence among the Greek chiefs. The text leaves unresolved several questions. First, how exactly does Aeneas recognize himself in the painted figures? But more importantly, what is he doing among the Greeks? As Joseph Farrell points out in an important 2012 article, quote, such a recognition is tantalizing since this is one episode among so many that are easily put in their proper place within the Trojan cycle that we cannot confidently identify. Does Aeneas find himself in parley or in battle with the Greek leaders? End of quote. Modern commentators tend to interpret permixtum as fighting against, following Homeric parallels. Conington, in particular, draws attention to Iliad 20, where Poseidon rescues Aeneas from Achilles. The god tells him not to confront Achilles again while the hero lives, but that after Achilles' death, he may fight bravely in the front ranks, meta protoisi makestai. It is therefore legitimate to read this image of sequoque principibus per mixtum agnovit Achilles as a visual realization of Poseidon's prophecy or exhortation. And yet the matter is complicated by the chronological order of subsequent scenes in the temple's ekphrasis. The arrival of Memnon and Penthesilea clearly presuppose a moment before the death of Achilles, who kills both of them. So if the painting reflects that earlier stage in the war, how can Aeneas be shown mingling with the Greek leaders after Achilles' death? There is, in fact, a certain ambiguity in line 488, and we might consider a different reading of the scene in Juno's temple. The verb permixtus does not necessarily imply combat. In Aeneid 10 to 38 line, the closest parallel for this usage refers simply to a mingling of allied troops. Building this point, Frederick Hall, in a 1989 article, proposed that what Aeneas sees in the temple may be, quote, a negative or ambiguous representation of himself, which he would wish to resolve in his favor, end of quote. In other words, Aeneas may be confronting an image of his own past that it is uncomfortable or open to multiple interpretations. At first glance, such a notion of narrative or representational ambiguity might strike us as suspiciously modern or even anachronistic. But what our curiously overlooks is that this line, 1488, already posed a problem for ancient interpreters of Vergil, and we are able to reconstruct some of their discussions. Servius, commenting on this verse, offer the following gloss. Sequoque principibus per mixtum agnovit Achilles, aut latenter provitionem tancit, aut virtutem eius vultos tendere, nimia enim fortitudinis est inter ostium tela versari. Cornutus tamen dicit versu isto, vadimus immixti Danais, hoc est solvendum. This line either subtly alludes to betrayal, or it is meant to highlight his bravery, since it takes exceptional courage to move among enemy weapons. Cornutus, however, says that the difficulty in this line should be resolved by comparing to 396, we go mingled with the Greeks. According to Servius, there are two possibilities. Either Vergil is subtly alluding to Aeneas's betrayal, or he is showcasing Aeneas's extraordinary courage. If it seems too far-fetched that Aeneas could mistake for an honorable depiction a scene showing him in conversation with the Greek leaders, we should recall that one ancient version of the myth claimed precisely that, according to Menecrates of Xanthus, Aeneas betrayed Troy and became one of the Achaeans, even fighting alongside them. So this reading is not only far from being a modern or anachronistic imposition, and it is also not simply a product of late antique interpretive habits. In fact, the final sentence of Servius's note makes reference to the interpretation offered by Cornutus. Now, this is Lucius Annaeus Cornutus, the Stoic philosopher, a friend of Persius and Lucan, who was born around 20 CE and died after 68 CE. Cornutus explains line 1488 by linking it to Aeneid 396, where Aeneas recounts how, during the night of Troy's fall, he and his companions advanced in mixed Danaes, mingled with the Greeks, after having donned the armor of fallen enemies at the ill-fated suggestion of Corybus. Thus, what Aeneas sees depicted in the temple may be a representation of that very moment, of himself in Greek armor, which he later describes to Dido in Book 2. This would mean he is not fighting alongside the Greeks, nor negotiating with them, but simply mistaken about the perspective of the artist who depicted him in this ambiguous visual context. As Georgi already observed in his 1891 book, The Antique Aeneis Critique, Cornutus would never have proposed such a reading unless he was responding to an existing interpretive difficulty, what he might call difficulty, a question. It is likely that early critics had rejected the notion that per mixtum could refer to battle, and so proposed instead that the line latenter proditionem tangit. This strand of criticism, which challenges the moral integrity of Aeneas, seems to go back further than Cornutus. Perhaps Georgi speculates even to Carvilius Pictor. The ambiguity that I and others detect in line 1488 will not, of course, persuade everyone, nor do I expect it to. But it's important to bear in mind that this ambiguity was already apparent to the earliest readers of the Aeneid, those Roman and Augustan readers for whom the poem was in the first instance written. However, on one crucial issue, readers of this passage remain divided, namely, what is the significance of Aeneas's misreading for us, the readers of the Aeneid? Virtually all interpreters agree that Aeneas's emotional reaction to the scenes depicted in the temple is in some sense misguided, probably because it is dominated by emotion. But what then is the takeaway for the reader of the Aeneid? Are we meant to conclude that one should not respond to a work of art merely by yielding to its emotional and pathetic force, to the general effect it communicates? Does Aeneas commit a potentially dangerous error by responding sentimentally to a work of art without reflecting on the intention of its artists and patrons? It is only thanks to divine intervention, Jupiter's dispatch of Mercury and Venus's deployment of Cupid, that Aeneas does not suffer the consequences of this misreading. He is spared only because Dido and the Carthaginians are divinely manipulated in welcoming him. Or is Vergil suggesting something else entirely? If his hero Aeneas reacts in this way, way, moved, emotionally vulnerable, unable to step back and question the ideological implication of the artwork, then perhaps we too are allowed to react emotionally. In short, it is Aeneas presented here as a positive model for the reader of a negative one. In an article I published in 2004, dedicated to the episode of Nisus and Euryalus in Aeneid 9, I argued that when the two Trojans slaughter a large number of Italians in their sleep, the reader is invited to feel revulsion at the massacre carried out by the young heroes and compassion for their victims. It did not matter, I suggested, that Nisus and Euryalus are Trojans, that they are acting on a mission entrusted by them by Eurus, the progenitor of Augustus, or that they are ultimately declared Fortunati Ambo. At the very moment where their action result in the slaughter of proto-Romans, the Roman reader, I claim, is allowed, perhaps even encouraged, to empathize with the victims and to believe that the price of Roman glory is ethically troubling. And in this light, I recalled the Doloneia in the paintings of the Temple of Juno, where we have a model for the negative reader who resists the bias of the text. But I now found it difficult to assign any positive function at all to Aeneas' emotional reaction to the temple's paintings. It is precisely the intellectual attention to detail that allows us to see that Aeneas is mistaken. The ideal reader of the Aeneid is not one who allows themselves to be swept away by pathos and emotional affect. What Vergil promotes, I would argue, is not a pathetic reading of the text, but a rational, distanced one that allows us to recognize where and why Aeneas is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. This was
Wonderful.
great, as expected. And now, what I usually do, we have little time. We have just like 10 minutes. What I usually do is that we ask the first speaker, Aaron, to say something like an immediate reaction
Absolutely.
to.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to give a very quick hip take. I mean, first of all, Sergio, thank you so much for this. Actually, I think our two interventions go together or maybe against one another in a very interesting and productive way. Because as you pointed out so clearly in the end of your intervention, the figuring out what Aeneas gets wrong happens through cool rationality and textual analysis, whereas what I had been looking at in mind was precisely the nature of Aeneas's emotional reaction. One thing that occurs to me in terms of talking about reading it right and wrong is there's also a temporal dimension to this, which is that, of course, I mean, in a way, as you say, and as you show quite clearly, Aeneas is and in this interpretation, going back to Otis and perhaps back to Cornutus and even farther back, Aeneas is wrong to think that this is what Juno and her Carthaginians had in mind when they painted these images. On the other hand, he's actually right that eventually Juno will mean exactly these things in precisely this way, which is to say that Juno, at the time when Virgil's readers are reading this, has become favorable, in fact, especially favorable to the Romans. And Virgil helps us with this right at this introduction to Juno here by calling her Regia Juno hu monstrarat, which gives us both the cult title of Juno Regina and also Juno hu monstrarat, which would be Juno Moneta, the two greatest Junos of the city of Rome. So we are already pointing forward towards a new reality of Juno's relationship to the Roman people. And here what's fascinating is the nature of reading and misreading, or prophecy and misprophecy in the poem. And I'm thinking here of what Sinon says, Sinon, when he predicts to the Trojans that if they bring the horse into the gates, then they will even be able to take the gates take the fight to the Greeks themselves and conquer their lands. Now, as it turns, he means that as a lie, but it turns out to be true, because it gets this misreading by history turns out to force it into a new kind of truth. Of course, Virgil is doing the same with Homer. He's reading Homer. Homer doesn't mean half the things that Virgil's going to make him say, half, even 90%. But Virgil's going to make him say these things. And if I started with Wallace Stevens, of this nomadic sense of being thrown into the world that is not ours, and that we do not understand, then I think it makes sense to end my own hip take and hip reaction to your very rich talk with a nod to Wallace Stevens' greatest critic, Harold Bloom, who in his Anxiety of Influence and his Map of Misreading, 1973, 1975, gave precisely a model of how poets are at work precisely misreading their predecessors. And here if one were to twist, as it were, Aeneas's misreading, it is a misreading that has legs as long as the Trojan horse, and that will take us right to the battlements of the cities of the Greeks.
Okay, very well. Let's see if someone has something to ask. Please, sentitevi assolutamente liberi di parlare nella lingua che volete. Tutte le lingue sono permesse. Basta parlare lentamente, ci capiamo tutti. Quindi per favore sentitevi liberi, è una discussione aperta a tutti. Mi sembra che siamo tutti molto inibiti e probabilmente anche stanchi. A questo punto do di nuovo la parola a Sergio qualora volesse reagire a quest'ulteriore osservazione di Aaron.
I perfectly agree with Aaron view of longer perspective and the long project of history of faith, and that things can be seen in a very different way from that perspective. What interests me, it was, I was usually, my former idea was that somehow Aeneas was a model for the reader, so we can misread, as Aeneas does, the Aeneid. We can not take into proper consideration of having reference towards what we know to be the intention of the text, of the author, and of the power which committed the poem. And I started, in fact, to write this talk with this idea. Then I realized that it's not is simplistic and contradictory, because it is precisely the intellectual attention to detail that allows us to see that Aeneas is mistaken. The ideal reader of the Aeneid is not one who allows themselves to be swept away by pathos. If we were to have this approach, we should not have understood that what is the what Vergil wants us to understand of this from this passage in terms of aesthetics and interpretation. So I changed my mind, and I'm much more inclined to see Aeneas as a negative model for the reader. And it would be interesting, and Joe Farrell does that in a very interesting way, to follow diachronically the evolution of Aeneas as a observer and interpreter of works of art, because this is the first of them, and seeing, and the Farrell traces an interesting line from the first, for his first reaction to one work of art, the pictures of the Temple of Juno, and the last one, his reaction to the baldric of Pallas, the first one who doesn't inspire any action on his part, apart from taking this inspiration of seeing Carthaginian as sympathetic to his sufferings. But when he does take action, it's another extremely troubling and discussed, and the most discussed episode of the All Aeneid. Here's the killing of Pallas, which Vergil somehow manages to connect with an ekphrasis, having in Book 10 described what is depicted on that baldric, and the killing of the Danates, the killing of by the Danates. And so it's my interest in this ekphrasis is to try to understand what can we draw from the way the characters interpret them, in terms of what Vergil foresees and foreknowledge will be the reaction of his own readers.
Okay, that was, of course, very rich, and I think at this point we can conclude our conversation. Thank you so much, both speakers, Sergio for proposing the test and Aaron for having accepted this proposal. And I look forward to receiving your proposals for the next cycle. If you want, everybody's welcome. I keep repeating it. Whatever you would like to present. Also, not only Greek and Latin text, but Titubanti Testi is also open to text connected somehow to the classical tradition. Everybody's welcome. Please let me know. I wish you all a wonderful summer, and I'm going to see you again next semester, starting from October. Thank you so much again. Grazie
mille Marco, è stato un vero piacere e un onore, Sergio. Grazie, Sergio.
Thank you, Marco and Aaron. It was great.
It was really, really wonderful. I'm so sad it's come to an end. Can't wait to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Marco.
Grazie a voi. Ciao.
Ciao.